Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading issue number 166, and just a little catch-up on what happened in the last issue. John is in the town of Highwater, and he came here for two reasons. The first reason is his own, and that is because he wanted to apologize to the wife of his friend Lucky, who killed himself and who John went to prison for the murder of, even though he didn't do it. And the second reason he's here is because Agent Frank Turo told John to go to Highwater because someone named S.W. Manor is involved in what's going on here. And Highwater is actually a town in the Pacific Northwest, but there seems to be a lot of white supremacist activity here, and apparently S.W. Manor has something to do with that. So inside the town, a lot of the people there are neo-Nazis, and there's a man named Major Gage, who is kind of the leader of these skinheads. And in the last issue, he sent the neo-Nazi skinheads on a mission to get some guns from a man that drove up from LA. That guy's name was Wolfman. And Gage told his boys to be careful of Wolfman because he doesn't just sell to white people, he sells to all minorities in LA, and specifically black people. And of course, the neo-Nazis did not like that. And so they were very confrontational when they came to buy the guns from Wolfman. And Wolfman kind of pushed it pretty far where he was joking with them and kind of making fun of their beliefs, and they did not take to that kindly. So they proceeded to stab him and then beat him very badly in the street. We don't know if he's dead or not yet, but from the injuries they showed with like his fingers being stepped on and his teeth getting kicked out, it seemed that if he didn't die, it would be pretty serious injuries. Now, in the meantime, while that's going on, John had been talking to Marjorie, Lucky's wife, and she has somehow fallen in with these neo-Nazis. She's buying into their propaganda about being special because she's white, and she's never had anyone tell her that she's special for any reason, so she is feeling like this is the correct way to be, and she actually introduces John to the man who introduced her to those ideas. So John sat down and listened to a long speech from Gage about why the white race is better than everybody else, and at the end of it, we were expecting him to be like, this is terrible, this is horrible, but he actually stood up and said, this all makes a lot of sense. And at the end of the last issue, I posited that, of course, this is probably him just playing along so that he can get the one-up on them, which has kind of been his motif in the last couple story arcs, especially like the prison story arc that started the Azzarello run, and also in the Good Intentions story arc where John was in Doglick and was kind of going along with things you wouldn't think he would, but then at the end, it kind of turned out he was doing it to trick these people. So that's where we left off in the last issue with a very ominous panel of John looking at his reflection in a window and him telling Colonel Gage that all this racist stuff makes a lot of sense. So first things first, with issue 166, we got the cover. We got the same motif of the swastika made of crosses at the top. And then there are 5 panels of faces or other people like putting their hands in front of their mouths. But we can't really tell what's going on from them. It just looks kind of ominous. And the largest panel on the page is a panel of John talking to a man in silhouette. So we can't really see anything about them. And they're sitting across from each other as they're speaking. And also on this page, we can see that this is written by Brian Azzarello with art by Marcelo Fruscian. And as we turn to the first page, we get the same kind of motif again when we're seeing like pretty skies and trees and birds flying. Then we see a car driving down the road, and inside is Major Gage. And over these panels, Marjorie narrates, "Hatred is destructive. If you hate something, you want to tear it down, rip it apart, make it worthless. I hated myself for more years than I care to remember. All my life, I felt inadequate, like who I was wasn't enough, and what I was wasn't right. Not just holding the short stick, but being the short stick. I couldn't ever measure up to what I saw I was supposed to. Not the people on TV, or in magazines, or in the movies. I could never be that way. I'd never look that good, or live in a house that big, or have that kind of money or that kind of love. Never, ever. And I felt ashamed. Then we turn the page and we see Gage is coming up to a man who's already parked and standing outside of his car, and neither of these men look very happy. And the man who's waiting for Gage is just staring in the woods, but we can't see what he's staring at yet. And then as Gage parks, he gets out and he says, "All right, Sean, what's so blessed important that you had to get me out of the house this early?" And Sean, not looking at him, but still looking at the trees, says, "Better early than too late." Then Gage turns to look at what he's seeing, and we turn the page and we see Wolfman, or I should say the body of Wolfman, who has been strung up in a tree by his feet, so he's hanging upside down, and his shirt has been pulled down, and he is all bloody and beaten, of course, just like he was left by the neo-Nazis, and I'm assuming they're the ones who strung him up here. And on his stomach is carved the words "N-word lover." And of course, it doesn't say N-word, it says the actual word, but I'm not going to read that. And we also see on this page that the name of the issue is Highwater Part 3. So as the two men stare at the body, we see all these flies around, and Sean says, "What'd I tell you about them punks, Ellison?" But Gage fires back, "What'd I tell you, Sean? Those boys are the next generation. We can't afford to lose them. They're young people, immature in their faith and beliefs, but they're our future." But Sean doesn't like what he's hearing, and he says, "Future? We're not going to have a future. The feds get wind of this." And then out of nowhere, John Constantine appears from the woods, and he begins to walk towards the men, and he says, "Well then, we'll have to do our best to keep the air deathly still, won't we?" And as John walks up to the men, Sean looks at John and says, "Who the hell?" But he's cut off by Gage, who says, "What are you doing here, Mr. Constantine?" And John pulls out a cigarette and lights it and says, "After our talk last night, Major Gage, I had some thinking to do. So I went for a stroll. Came across this bump here in me road." And when he says bump here, he points to the corpse of Wolfman hanging. And then Sean points to John and then looks at Gage and asks, "Ellison, who is this?" And Gage kind of smiles at John, and John smiles back, and Gage answers, "He's a friend of Marjorie's." And John adds, "Friend of yours, too." And then all three men turn to Wolfman's body and they stare at it for a minute. And then Gage says, "Sean, does anybody else know about this?" And Sean answers, "No, just you, me, and our friend." And as he says that last part, he side-eyes John. And then John points to Gage's car and says, "Let's not forget your stowaway there, Major." Then we see in the back seat of his car that he drove here, the daughter of Major Gage sits up. She's like a young 14-year-old girl who has blonde hair and blue eyes and is wearing like a yellow sundress. And as Gage and Sean see her, Gage says, "Gwyneth?" And then Gwyneth gets out of the car and she walks towards her dad and says, "I'm sorry, Daddy. I overheard you on the phone and you seemed upset. And then when she reaches the men, she stares at the body of Wolfman hanging and she asks, "Is it true what they wrote on him?" And the men don't answer, but they just don't say anything. They just kind of stare. And then she takes a moment and she scrunches her face like she's disgusted at what she's seeing. And then she says, "Then he deserved this." But before she can say anything else, Gage takes her by the shoulders and pushes her towards Sean. And he says, "Sean, take her home." And as Sean takes her, he says, "Come on, Gwen." So Sean puts her in the car and then they drive away. And as John and Gage stare at the body, we kind of get a focused panel on the broken fingers of Wolfman. And there's a bunch of ants crawling over his hand. And John says, "The lads are certainly exuberant, Major. But that's the thing about youth, isn't it? Tends to overdo it getting the point across." And then John gives a big smile and says, "So, I'll be needing a hacksaw if I'm going to settle this bit of your problem." And as John walks towards Gage's car, Gage asks, "This bit?" And John answers, "Don't worry none. I've had experience in these matters. Though I wouldn't have the slightest idea where to dump a car around these parts." Then John gets to the back of Gage's car, and Gage pops the trunk, and as they look inside, Gage says, "His car," and John cuts him off saying, "Right. My guess is one of those lads of yours has taken possession of it. It's not wise to be seen with another man's property, especially if he's gone missing." Then he seems to find what he's looking for in the trunk, and he brings it up, and we can see it's a hacksaw, and then John smiles at Gage and says, "Brilliant. This'll do nicely." And then John walks back towards Wolfman's body, and as Gage walks over to the driver's side of his car, John turns around and says, "Major, what you said before about young people, suppose that sometimes the best way to teach them the right way to go about things is to teach them a lesson." And I think right there, John is doing some of his influencing magic where he's kind of using his words to push someone to do what he wants. Because we can see Gage is kind of taking John's words to heart. He's got kind of a sour look on his face. So I could definitely see this as some kind of suggestive magic or something like that. Then we turn the page and we cut to Jimmy, the leader of the skinheads, and he's in his home sleeping in his room, and his wife is coming up to him with her baby, and she says, "Jimmy?" And then she begins to shake him from his arm and says, "Jimmy, wake up, hon." And a sleepy Jimmy replies, "Leave me alone." But we can see that Jimmy's wife is not happy about that response, and she's also in like a waitress's uniform. And she says, "Jimmy." And then Jimmy turns over and opens his eyes and says, "What?" And then she hands the baby over to him and says, "I gotta go to work." And then she walks over to the mirror and starts adjusting her uniform. And then we see Jimmy is fully awake now, and he turns over and sees his baby boy on the bed next to him. And he picks him up and he says, "Come here, little man." And he lifts him up into the air. And the baby is smiling, and so is Jimmy. And I should mention, just in case you forgot, that Jimmy's room has a bunch of like Nazi paraphernalia and flags of like the Confederacy and swastikas and stuff. And I think Azzarello and Fruscian are using this like very provocative imagery in the background to contrast the way that he interacts with his family and son specifically. Because in any other context, you'd be thinking, "Oh, that's cute." But then in the background of him lifting his son up, there's a swastika. So as Jimmy's wife checks her makeup in the mirror, we see Jimmy sitting on the bed with his boy, and they're kind of playing. And she says, "Rex called, said him and the boys were meeting down at the tap." And Jimmy asks, "Oh, yeah?" And she answers, "Yeah. And I told him you had to babysit." And then Jimmy asks again, "Oh, yeah?" And then she turns and looks at him like she's not very pleased with his response. And she says, "Yeah. Don't you be bringing my son into no bar." And Jimmy kind of looks annoyed at that and says, "Your son?" And she answers, "That's right." But it seems like maybe this was just kind of like a friendly jest back and forth, because she goes over to Jimmy, and as she kisses him, he says, "I love you, darling." And as she finishes kissing him, she says, "And I love you. Be good, you hear?" And then she kisses the head of her son, and then Jimmy jokingly asks, "Talking to me or him?" And she says, "Both of you." Then we turn the page and we cut back to John, who's taking a smoke break because he has just cut down the body of Wolfman, who is lying on the ground now. And from Wolfman's pocket, there is a cell phone ring. So John kneels down and finds the phone on the body, and then he answers it saying, "Adolf's Butcher Shop." But the man on the other end doesn't seem to realize that it's not Wolfman talking, so he says, "You mind telling me where the fuck you are?" Then we cut to inside of what looks like a marble room with lots of gold filigree everywhere, and there are pillars of marble in there. And we see this is the person who was talking to John. And John answers the man's question, even though it wasn't for John, it was for Wolfman, saying, "I'd say I'm up to me elbows in it." And then the man seems confused and asks, "Wolfman?" And John replies, "That's this sad bloke's name?" But there's no answer. There's just a click because the man John was talking to has hung up. And we cut to him looking at his cell phone. And this guy is your average white guy who's got a Tom Selleck mustache. In fact, he looks pretty much like Tom Selleck. He's got a suit on, and he begins to walk through what we see in the next couple panels is a giant mansion. And from the outside, we can see there's a bunch of palm trees and Greek statues and a lot of landscaping. So this guy that was just talking to John finally gets to a door, and he knocks on it saying, "Mr. Manor?" Then we cut to the inside of this room, where you see two men laying in a bed. One of them is completely naked, but he's facing down. And the man who answers, who we can assume is Manor, is moving the hand of the naked man off of him. So we can kind of assume that they're lovers or something. And that man says, "Come in, Fredo." And as Fredo enters, he stands up out of bed, and we can't see his face or anything. He's just standing up, and he is naked. And his body looks horribly scarred. There's lots of what looks like whip marks on his back and arms. But we can't see his front or his face because he's pretty much in shadow besides the skin on his back and arms. And as Fredo stares at him, he says, "Sir, I just tried calling Wolfman. So it looks like Wolfman was working for this Manor guy. But we don't get any more than that because we turn the page and we cut to Jimmy and his neo-Nazi friends at the bar. And they're all playing pool and drinking and laughing. And on the floor, we can see that Jimmy has brought his son because his son is playing with his toys on the ground. Then we see Gage walk in the front door, and he walks straight to Jimmy, and Jimmy turns around and smiles along with all the other skinheads because they think they've done a good job. But Gage is very angry, and then Jimmy hands him the envelope that's full of Wolfman's money. And I think this is why he thinks he did good, because he not only got the money, but he got the guns as well, and also killed Wolfman, who they perceived as a race traitor. So as Jimmy hands Gage the money, Gage doesn't take it. He just punches Jimmy in the face, knocking him over, and Jimmy lands right in front of his son on the ground, and he's bleeding from the mouth, and his son begins to cry, and Gage begins to yell at him, but we don't hear any of the words that are being said. These are all just panels being shown, and as Jimmy gets berated and his son begins to bawl, he looks very angry, and over these panels of Gage berating his men and punching Jimmy, we get the narration from Marjorie returning, and she's saying, "I felt ashamed because I was taught a lie, a myth. America, land of the free, home of the brave, wishful thinking, self-deception, but not self-inflicted. We're programmed from the time we can barely read to believe this as a fact, a myth, liberty and personal freedom. If we're so free, why are we so enslaved to licenses, restrictions, permits, taxes, that our freedoms exist solely on the whims of the government? Freedom's a myth. All men are created equal. We're taught this myth too, when it's such an obvious fact to both whites and blacks that it's just not true. If we're so equal, why do we need reverse discrimination, affirmative action, quota systems, welfare? It doesn't even seem like the liberals that came up with these policies believe blacks are equal. And they don't. The truth is, this country's gone to the devil, and that the people that are destroying what was once great about it and teaching us to hate ourselves through their media are one and the same, the Jews." Then we turn the page and we cut to John and Marjorie walking, and all the narration that I just read that was over the panels of Gage beating up Jimmy was what she's saying to John as they're walking. And she continues saying to John, "I mean, no one screams equality louder than Jews, and no one believes it less." Then we get a panel of a very haggard-looking John, because if you could imagine, all day today, he has been cutting up Wolfman's body and disposing of it. So his hair is all disheveled, and he's got bags under his eyes, and he's got stubble on his face. And as he lights a cigarette, he turns to her, and in response to what she was saying about no one believing in equality less than the Jews, John says, "'Cept you. So Marjorie, who do you hate more, the Jews or the blacks?" And Marjorie replies, "John, it's not about hatred of other races, but the love of one's own. And my racial beliefs are based on scriptural teachings." And John asks, "Taught by who?" And she answers, "Ellis and Gage pointed me in the right direction. The teachings are in the Bible." And as they walk by a couple of black teenagers sitting on a stoop, John says, "Written in black and white, I suppose." And she answers, "Look, for me to decide just on my own that another race is inferior with no scriptural basis for that decision would be sinful. And like it or not, God created the blacks, just as he did cats and dogs, and hating any of God's creations is morally wrong. But God didn't create the Jews. Satan did. And they won't rest until me and the people like me either turn their backs to God or are wiped from the face of creation. And don't think for a second they haven't already started. In this country now, I'm supposed to feel ashamed for being an American and a Christian? I hate those responsible for that. The Jews, the children of Satan." And John says, "Thanks for clearing that bit up. But it don't seem kosher." And he smiles as he says that last word, because obviously that's a Jewish word. Then we see they've arrived at a building, but we can't see what it is. It just is lit inside, and there's a sign that says open. And as he reaches for the handle, he looks at Marjorie and he asks, "If it's wrong to hate any of the Lord's creations?" And Marjorie interjects, "I believe it's a sin." And John continues his question, Right. a sin. So tell me then, who created Satan? And he smiles at her as he asks that, and she's just left dumbstruck because she's never thought of that before. And as John walks through the door, he says, night. And he just leaves her there with her thoughts. Then we cut to the inside of the room he's walking into, and we see it's the neo-Nazi bar. And John gives a finger gun to the bartender and says, how about a pint then? And he sits down as the bartender gets him one. And we see Jimmy and all the other skinheads are still in here, and they're giving very angry looks at John. And as John gets his pint, he turns to Jimmy, who's got a very bruised face that's kind of all cut up and stuff. And John says to him, looks like the Major's been around. And Jimmy immediately looks very angry at that. And we can also see that Kyle, the second in command, is looking like he wants to beat John up pretty bad as well. And Jimmy says, you son of a... But John cuts him off saying, now, lads, let's mind our tongues, seeing we's all in on the same secret. And all the neo-Nazis are just staring at John very angrily as they sit around a table. And to what John said about a secret, Jimmy asks, what? And then John reaches in his coat and he asks sarcastically, the Major box your ears as well? And then he removes from his coat the bloody hacksaw that he used to dismember Wolfman, and he's got a big grin on his face as he says, I'm the bloke he had clean up your mess. And then he puts the saw in the middle of the table, and then he pulls up a chair and sits down. And then Jimmy asks, what you do? And John answers, the less said about it, the better. And then he pulls out a cigarette, and as he lights it, he says, and I shouldn't have had to do it at all. And then Jimmy says, look, but John cuts him off saying, I mean, you left it as a message, right? So how the hell's anyone supposed to get it if they don't see it? And it was a very powerful message indeed. One that was lost on the Major. And then he points to Jimmy and says, he packs quite a punch for an old geezer, eh? And Jimmy answers, yeah. And then John leans back, kind of relaxed, and he says, that's tough love for you. Or tough luck. You get on his wrong side. And Jimmy, who's looking very annoyed, asks, what do you mean by that? And John answers, nothing. I just hope you lads haven't fallen out of his favor. I know a hard man when I see one. And I know how weaknesses in others makes him harder. And the way John emphasizes weakness is, of course, on purpose. It seems like he's doing his suggestive magic again. And we see Jimmy's very affected by the words John chooses because he asks, he thinks we're weak? And now all the skinheads are very angry looking as they lean forward, waiting for John to reply. And John says, I didn't say that, did I? And then he stands up from his chair and he says, well, maybe I did. Maybe you don't have the stomach for all this. And then he turns around and walks away from them, and one of the skinheads yells out, bullshit! And another says, we're behind the Major. We believe in him. When the shit hits, he can count on us. And then John walks over to the bar, and he puts his empty glass on it, and he says, course we can, lads. Course we can. And he's now talking to them through the mirror behind the bar, so he's looking at them, and they're behind him. And he says, and I'll make certain he knows as much. Leave it to me. And then he turns back around and walks towards them and says, see, I think we might be better served sending another message. And then he picks up the saw off the table and walks to the door. And as he exits, he asks, don't you? So it's kind of like he's leaving them with a question about what are you going to do about this? Are you going to send another message? Then we cut to John walking outside away from the bar. And as he walks, he lights a cigarette. And we can see the bloody hacksaw just wedged under the armpit of his left arm, and he passes some black men, and they kind of look at him weird, either because he's a white guy walking through their neighborhood in the middle of the night, or because he's got a bloody hacksaw under his arm, or both. So as he's walking away from them, one of them says, hey. So John stops and turns around, and then one of the men points to the hacksaw and asks, you looking to break into something? And then John pulls the hacksaw out from under his arm, and he holds it up to them, and he says, break in. No need for that. The door's wide fucking open. And then he walks away. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.